Picture this: December 7th, 1941, and Winston Churchill is sitting in his study at Chequers, the Prime Minister's quiet country home, when the news arrives like a thunderbolt. Japan has just attacked Pearl Harbor. Later, Churchill would write something remarkable about that night. He said he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. Think about that for a moment. For 2 long years, Britain had been standing almost completely alone against the full might of Nazi Germany, watching their cities burn under wave after wave of German bombs during the Blitz, and Churchill had been pleading, hoping, doing everything he possibly could to bring America into this war. And now, finally, it had happened. The United States was coming to fight. But Churchill understood something that night that most people didn't yet grasp. Knowing that America would join the war was one thing, but actually seeing American soldiers on British soil, marching through British streets, real and present and ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with his exhausted nation, that would be something else entirely, something that would change everything. Churchill had been working toward this moment for years, long before Pearl Harbor, even before the war officially began. As First Lord of the Admiralty back in 1939, and then as Prime Minister from May 1940 onward, he had written letter after letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. The correspondence between these two men was truly extraordinary. Over 1,700 messages exchanged during the war years. Churchill would sign his early letters with the phrase, "former naval person," a reference to his role as First Lord, and this created an intimate, personal tone that completely bypassed all the normal diplomatic channels and protocols. The relationship was strategic, absolutely, but it was also deeply emotional and personal. You see, Churchill's mother was American, born Jenny Jerome in Brooklyn, New York, and Churchill had always felt this profound connection to America. He had toured the country, made friends there, understood the American spirit. But beyond personal affinity, Churchill understood with crystal clarity exactly what Britain needed to survive. After France fell in June 1940, Britain stood completely alone in Western Europe against Hitler's war machine. The Soviet Union was still bound by its non-aggression pact with Germany, which meant Churchill needed America not just as a supplier of weapons and food, but as a true fighting partner. The Lend-Lease Act, passed by the United States Congress in March 1941, had been an absolute lifeline for Britain. American ships began bringing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food across the Atlantic, but ships and supplies weren't soldiers. They couldn't hold ground or storm beaches or fight in the trenches. Throughout 1941, as massive German armies drove deep into the Soviet Union after Hitler's invasion in June, Churchill watched and waited and hoped that something, anything, would finally bring America into the actual fighting. Pearl Harbor accomplished what all of Churchill's eloquence and persuasion could not. On December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan, and then 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, which meant Churchill immediately made plans to travel to Washington for a crucial conference with Roosevelt. He arrived on December 22nd and stayed through the new year, discussing strategy, coordinating plans, and building the alliance that would absolutely have to win this war if freedom was going to survive. But strategy meetings in Washington were abstract, distant, theoretical. The real test would come when American soldiers actually arrived in Britain, when you could see them and touch them and know they were real. The first American troops landed in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942. They were advance elements, small numbers, just the beginning of what would become an absolute flood of American forces. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, more and more arrived, and by the end of that year, over 100,000 American servicemen were stationed across Britain. By the time of D-Day in June 1944, that number would exceed 1.5 million soldiers. They came by ship, crossing the dangerous Atlantic in convoys, always watching the horizon for German U-boats that prowled those waters like wolves. They landed at Liverpool, at Belfast, at various ports scattered around the British Isles. They were young, most of them incredibly young, and many had never been outside America before in their entire lives. Suddenly they found themselves in a country that had been at war for over 2 years. A country marked by severe rationing and bombing damage and a bone-deep exhaustion that touched everything. The British reaction to these Americans was complicated and mixed. There was genuine gratitude, of course, because these men were coming to help fight a common enemy, to stand with Britain when Britain desperately needed friends. But there was also real friction and tension beneath the surface. The Americans seemed impossibly, almost offensively wealthy by British standards. They were paid far more than British soldiers earned. They had access to goods that ordinary British people hadn't seen in years. Their uniforms were better quality, and their rations were incredibly abundant compared to what British families survived on. The American military supplied its troops with what seemed like absolute luxuries to a population living on rations that had been cut and cut again and again. A famous phrase emerged during this time that captured the tension perfectly: overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It was usually said with humor, but humor that carried a sharp edge of resentment. British soldiers, who were paid just a fraction of what Americans earned, watched American GIs take British girls to dances and pubs and restaurants. British families, surviving on rations that allowed just 4 ounces of bacon per person per week, heard stories about American mess halls serving steak and ice cream and fresh fruit. But beneath all this friction was something much deeper and more important: hope, relief, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, the tide of this terrible war might actually turn in their favor. Churchill felt this more acutely, more desperately than anyone else in Britain. He understood the brutal mathematics of the war better than most. Germany had conquered most of Europe, its armies were vast and powerful and experienced, and its industries were producing weapons at an absolutely enormous rate that Britain simply couldn't match. Britain was holding on, surviving day by day, but holding on wasn't the same as winning, and Churchill knew it. The Soviet Union was bearing the absolutely crushing brunt of German military power on the Eastern Front. But that front was far away and the outcome was deeply uncertain. Britain needed America's massive industrial capacity, its seemingly limitless resources, and its fresh armies of young men who hadn't been ground down by years of war. Churchill had seen the supply ships arriving at British ports, had carefully tracked the numbers and figures, had approved plans for American bases and training facilities being built across Britain. But seeing the men themselves, actually seeing them march in formation through British streets with their own eyes, that would make it real in a way that shipping manifests and strategic planning documents and diplomatic cables never could. The moment finally came on a gray, overcast afternoon in London, the kind of dreary day that England is famous for. The exact date matters less than what this moment represented for Churchill and for Britain. American troops were being moved through the city, a large contingent marching in tight formation from one railway station to another across the heart of London. These weren't the first Americans Churchill had seen in Britain by this point, because by now, months into 1942, American soldiers had become a fairly common sight on British streets. But this particular march was different, special somehow. This was a formal military march through the very heart of London, through streets that had been bombed during the Blitz, past buildings that still showed ugly damage and scars from German air raids that had tried to break British spirit. Churchill made absolutely sure to be there to witness it. He positioned himself where he could watch them pass, where he could see every detail. His staff knew better than to interfere when the Prime Minister wanted to witness something personally, so they quietly arranged for him to have a clear, unobstructed view somewhere he could stand and watch without causing too much disruption to the march or drawing too much attention. The Americans came marching in long columns, their boots striking the pavement in a steady, rhythmic beat that echoed off the damaged buildings. They wore their uniforms crisp and clean, their helmets polished, and they carried their rifles with easy confidence. They were young men, most of them just 18, 19, 20 years old, barely more than boys really. They marched with the particular bearing and confidence of American soldiers, perhaps less rigid and formal than British troops, but confident in a way that was unmistakably American. They knew, even if they didn't fully understand it yet, that they were part of something absolutely enormous and historic. They had grown up hearing stories about the Great War, about American doughboys going over there to fight in France during World War I, and now they were doing exactly the same thing, following in those footsteps from a generation before, coming across the ocean to Europe to fight another terrible German war. London crowds gathered spontaneously to watch them pass, drawn by the sound of marching boots and the sight of American uniforms. Office workers came out of their buildings, shopkeepers stood in their doorways, and people lined the sidewalks 3 and 4 deep in places. Some people clapped, some waved small flags, and children called out excitedly to the passing soldiers. The Americans grinned broadly, waved back enthusiastically, and somehow maintained their tight formation even while interacting with the crowds. Churchill watched in complete silence at first, his characteristic energy stilled for once. His eyes moved slowly along the columns, taking in every detail of the sight before him. His face, usually so expressive and animated, was difficult to read in that moment. Those who stood close to him later reported that his eyes were wet with tears, though he made no effort to hide them or wipe them away immediately. For 2 long years, Churchill had carried the absolutely crushing weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders alone. 2 years of making speeches that rallied the nation when spirits were lowest, of making desperate, impossible decisions about where to send Britain's limited resources, of choosing which cities to defend and which to leave vulnerable. 2 years of watching young British men, boys really, go off to fight in the scorching deserts of North Africa, in the dangerous waters of the Mediterranean, in the skies over Germany where death came fast and fiery. 2 years of reading casualty reports that listed names of the dead and missing, knowing each name represented a family destroyed by grief. 2 years of visiting bombed cities and seeing the devastation firsthand, of talking to families who had lost everything, of knowing deep in his soul that Britain was stretched to its absolute breaking point and beyond. And now, finally, here were the Americans marching past him. Not hundreds but thousands of them, with thousands and thousands more coming across the Atlantic every single day. An entire nation's military power and industrial might being deployed to Britain, preparing to take the fight directly to Hitler's Europe, to storm the beaches and liberate the conquered territories. Someone standing near Churchill, one of his staff members or security detail, quietly asked him what he thought of the sight. The Prime Minister was silent for a long moment, still watching the marching troops pass by in their endless columns. Then he spoke, and his voice carried all the emotion and weight of those 2 impossible years of standing alone against tyranny. "When I see these young men," he said slowly, carefully, "I know we are going to win this war." It was such a simple statement, just 13 words, but it carried absolutely enormous weight and meaning. Churchill was not a man given to simple optimism or empty cheerleading. He understood the terrible realities of modern industrial warfare better than almost anyone alive, understood exactly how difficult and bloody the road ahead would be. The invasion of France was still 2 full years away, 2 years of preparation and planning and dying. The Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats was at its absolute height, with ships being sunk faster than they could be replaced. The war in North Africa was still undecided, with armies surging back and forth across the desert. The Soviets were locked in an absolutely desperate, brutal struggle at Stalingrad where the fate of the Eastern Front hung in the balance. But seeing these Americans march through London, seeing the physical manifestation of American commitment right there in front of him, Churchill allowed himself to believe in victory not just as a distant possibility or a desperate hope, but as an absolute inevitability, something that would happen as surely as the sun would rise tomorrow. He elaborated, speaking to those gathered around him, and his words came tumbling out in that characteristic Churchill manner, with phrases building on phrases in great rolling waves of rhetoric. "They are so young, so strong, so confident," he said, watching yet another column pass by. "Look at them carefully. They have come 3,000 miles across a dangerous ocean to help us, to stand with us." His voice grew stronger and more emphatic. "They have come to fight for freedom, for civilization, for democracy, for everything we have been defending these 2 long years." His voice grew even stronger now, almost defiant. "Hitler has made his greatest mistake, perhaps the greatest mistake any leader has ever made. He thought America would stay neutral, would stay out of Europe's wars, would let him conquer the continent unopposed." Churchill paused for effect, his timing perfect as always. "He thought Britain would fall or surrender when we stood alone. He was wrong on both counts, catastrophically wrong. Now he faces not just Britain with its defiance, not just Russia with its endless manpower, but America as well, the greatest industrial power on earth, with the greatest reserve of fresh troops and resources." Churchill's voice rang out clearly now. All of it, every factory, every shipyard, every airplane, every soldier, all of it now committed to his complete and utter destruction. Churchill paused again, pulling out his handkerchief to wipe his eyes without any embarrassment or shame. He was never embarrassed by honest emotion. "I have waited so long for this moment," he said more quietly, almost to himself. "So terribly long." The people standing around him understood completely without any need for explanation. They had lived through exactly the same years, felt the same fears that kept them awake at night. They remembered the summer of 1940 when German invasion seemed not just possible but imminent, when everyone expected to see German paratroopers dropping from the sky any day. They remembered the Blitz when London burned night after night after night, when you went to bed never knowing if your home would still be standing in the morning. They remembered the terrible losses at sea, the U-boats sinking ship after ship until it seemed the Atlantic itself was against them. They remembered the defeats and retreats in France, in Greece, in Crete, the constant string of bad news. They remembered the desperate holding action in North Africa where Rommel seemed unstoppable. They remembered the constant, gnawing question that nobody wanted to voice aloud. How long can we possibly hold out? The Americans marching past represented the answer to that terrible question. They represented not just military power, though that was absolutely crucial and desperately needed. They represented complete vindication of everything Churchill had argued for, everything he had worked toward through those dark years, everything he had believed when belief seemed foolish. His long courtship of Roosevelt, his soaring speeches about Anglo-American partnership and shared values, his deep belief that the English-speaking peoples would ultimately stand together against tyranny, all of it was being proven right in the most tangible, visible, undeniable way possible. As the march continued, column after column passing by in what seemed an endless stream, Churchill's mood gradually shifted from purely emotional to more analytical and strategic. He began pointing out specific details to his staff, his tactical mind engaging even in this emotional moment. "Notice their equipment carefully," he said, gesturing toward the passing soldiers. "Modern, well-made, abundant. They have the industrial capacity to equip millions of men exactly like this. Millions upon millions." He watched their faces closely, studying their expressions. They are eager to fight, you can see it in their eyes. They want to prove themselves. That eagerness will cost some of them their lives before this is over. There's no avoiding that terrible fact. But it will also carry them through things that tired, worn-out men simply cannot do anymore. Fresh troops change everything. Churchill was already thinking ahead, his mind racing through possibilities and plans, considering how to use this American energy and enthusiasm, how to coordinate hard-won British experience with fresh American strength and resources. "We must train them properly," he said firmly. "They are brave, no question about that, but they are inexperienced in the harsh realities of combat. We have been fighting for 2 solid years now. We know things they do not know yet, things learned in blood. We must teach them everything we have learned, share every hard lesson, and we must learn from them as well, learn from their energy and innovation. Someone mentioned the friction between British and American troops that everyone had noticed, the complaints about pay differences and the resentment about American abundance in a time of British scarcity. Churchill waved it away impatiently, dismissing it as irrelevant. "Of course there is friction," he said bluntly. "Put any 2 large groups of young men together and there will always be friction and rivalry. But they are on our side, fighting for the same cause. That is the only thing that truly matters in the end. They are here, they are real, they are committed, and they are going to help us win this war." The march took well over an hour, column after column of American soldiers passing through the heart of London in an apparently endless procession. Churchill stayed for absolutely all of it, watching intently until the very last troops had marched past and disappeared from view. He seemed genuinely reluctant to leave, as if the sight was physically sustaining him, feeding something deep inside that he had been running on empty for far too long. When it was finally over, when the last American soldier had passed, Churchill turned decisively to his staff with new energy. "I want to meet some of them personally," he said with characteristic directness. "Arrange for me to visit an American base as soon as possible. I want to talk to these young men face to face. I want to thank them personally for coming." The visits were carefully arranged over the following months, and Churchill made an absolute point of visiting American units stationed all across Britain whenever his schedule allowed. He would sometimes arrive almost unannounced or with minimal warning, because he wanted to see the troops as they actually were in their daily lives, not all dressed up and staged for a formal inspection. He would walk casually through their camps, stop to talk to small groups of soldiers, ask them where they were from back home, what they thought of Britain and British people, whether they were being treated well and had everything they needed. The American soldiers were often genuinely startled and amazed to suddenly find the British Prime Minister right there in their midst. Churchill was instantly recognizable to everyone, impossible to mistake. The round figure, the famous bulldog face, the ever-present cigar clamped in his teeth. He would shake hands warmly with everyone, make jokes that had them laughing, ask genuine questions and actually listen to the answers. He wanted them to know beyond any doubt that they were appreciated, wanted them to understand what their presence meant to Britain and to him personally. In one camp, he found a group of soldiers from Texas, and his face lit up. "Texas!" he exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "I have been to Texas myself. Wonderful state, absolutely vast and full of tremendous energy. You Texans are known throughout the world for your fighting spirit and your courage. We shall need exactly that spirit in the difficult days ahead." The soldiers grinned broadly, genuinely pleased that this famous British leader knew something specific about their home state and cared enough to mention it. At another base, he encountered soldiers who had literally just arrived, who were still processing the reality of being in Britain, still adjusting to being so far from home. "You have come such a long way," Churchill told them seriously, his voice warm and fatherly. "You have left your homes, your families, everything familiar and comfortable. You have come to a country that has been at war for over 2 years, that is tired and worn down and damaged. But I tell you this with complete sincerity. Your arrival has lifted our spirits more than you can possibly imagine or understand. When we see you walking our streets, we see hope renewed. We see strength arriving. We see victory coming closer." He absolutely meant every single word, and they could hear it in his voice. Churchill understood symbolism deeply, understood the enormous power of morale and spirit in warfare. But this wasn't just symbolism or propaganda or empty words. The Americans represented real, tangible military power, real divisions that could be deployed to battlefields, real air squadrons that could bomb German cities and factories, real ships that could protect the vital convoys. The strategic implications were absolutely enormous and transformative. Churchill and his military chiefs could now begin planning operations that would have been completely impossible before American entry into the war. North Africa could be properly reinforced with fresh troops. An invasion of Italy could be seriously contemplated and planned. And eventually, the great invasion of France itself could be planned in detail. Operation Overlord D-Day, the absolutely massive amphibious assault that would require American troops, American landing craft, American air power, American logistics, American everything. But standing there in that moment, watching the Americans march through London, Churchill wasn't thinking in specific detail about particular operations or battle plans. He was thinking about something more fundamental, more profound. He was thinking about what it meant that these men were here at all, what their presence represented for the future. For 2 solid years, Britain had fought on with desperate courage and determination, but always with one terrible question hanging over everything like a dark cloud. Can we actually win this war? Can we really defeat Germany with all its power and resources? Or are we just postponing the inevitable, just delaying our defeat? The Americans marching past him answered that fundamental question definitively and finally. Yes, Britain could win. Not alone, certainly not alone, but with allies, with friends, with partners. With American industrial might and Soviet manpower and British determination and experience all combined together, yes, Germany could absolutely be defeated, could be crushed, could be destroyed. Churchill had given his famous, defiant speech after Dunkirk back in June 1940, when things looked darkest. "We shall fight on the beaches," he had declared with fierce determination. "We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." It was magnificent, stirring defiance that had rallied the nation in its darkest hour, but it was defiance based primarily on will and stubbornness, not on certainty of victory. Now, standing here watching the Americans march through London, Churchill could add something new and transformative to that defiance. And we shall win. We shall actually, truly, certainly win. The relationship between British and American forces would definitely have its challenges and difficulties going forward. There were significant disagreements about strategy and approach. Churchill wanted to attack Germany through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning through Italy and potentially the Balkans, an indirect approach. The Americans, particularly General George Marshall, wanted a direct, massive assault straight across the English Channel into France, the most direct route to Berlin. There were tensions about command structures, about who would lead combined operations, about authority and responsibility. There were the inevitable cultural clashes between British and American soldiers, differences in style and approach and attitude. But beneath all of those challenges and tensions and disagreements was one fundamental reality that Churchill grasped completely that day, watching the march with tears in his eyes. America was in the war now, fully committed with all its vast resources and power, and that single fact changed absolutely everything about the war's outcome. The young men marching through London that gray afternoon would go on to fight in some of the most brutal battles in human history. They would fight in the scorching deserts of North Africa against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They would fight in Sicily, storming ashore under heavy fire. They would fight their way up the mountainous spine of Italy through some of the most difficult terrain imaginable. They would storm the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, facing withering fire. They would fight in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, pushing the Germans back mile by bloody mile. They would fight in Germany itself, driving toward Berlin through fanatical resistance. Many of them, far too many, would die in those battles. American casualties in the European theater would ultimately exceed 300,000, with over 100,000 dead, left behind in cemeteries across Europe. They would fight at places whose names would become absolutely legendary. burned into history. Omaha Beach, where the water ran red with blood. The Battle of the Bulge, where they held against everything Germany could throw at them. The Hurtgen Forest, where men fought for every yard in dark woods. The Rhine crossing, the final push into the heart of Germany. But they would win, they would succeed, they would triumph. Alongside British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied forces, alongside the massive Soviet armies grinding forward relentlessly from the east, the Americans would help crush Nazi Germany completely and utterly. The war would last another 3 long, bloody years after that march through London, 3 years of brutal, terrible fighting across Europe and Africa. But the outcome, from the moment America fully committed its power and resources, was ultimately decided. The question was no longer if the Allies would win, but when and at what cost. Churchill knew this, standing there on that gray London street watching the Americans pass by. He knew it in his bones, felt it in his soul. The emotion he felt so strongly, the tears that ran unashamedly down his famous face, came from relief as much as from joy. Relief that the crushing burden would finally be shared with others. Relief that Britain would not have to stand alone anymore against the darkness. Relief that victory was now possible, not just as a desperate hope whispered in the night, but as a realistic, achievable goal. In his detailed memoirs written during the years after the war, Churchill would return again and again to the central theme of Anglo-American partnership and cooperation. He would write extensively about what he called the special relationship between Britain and America, would argue passionately and persistently for maintaining close ties between the two nations in the post-war world. Some of this was certainly strategic calculation for the future. Britain would desperately need American support in the Cold War that followed, in facing down Soviet communism. But some of it, perhaps most of it, was genuine feeling, authentic emotion born in those dark years when American help and support had meant the absolute difference between survival and defeat, between freedom and slavery. The march through London was not the first time Churchill saw American troops in Britain, and it certainly would not be the last. But it represented something absolutely crucial and transformative, a turning point. It was the moment when American involvement became real and visible and tangible, when the alliance moved from diplomatic agreements and shipping manifests and abstract planning to actual soldiers marching through British streets where everyone could see them. Churchill had spent 2 years holding Britain together through sheer force of will and magnificent eloquence. He had given speeches that rallied the nation when spirits were at their lowest. He had made impossible decisions that kept Britain in the fight when surrender seemed easier. He had worked absolutely tirelessly to build the alliance that would win the war, writing those hundreds and hundreds of letters to Roosevelt. But will and eloquence, no matter how strong, could only accomplish so much. At some point, you needed actual armies, needed real soldiers, needed the physical power to fight back and win. The Americans brought exactly that power in overwhelming abundance. And watching them march through London on that gray afternoon, Churchill allowed himself to believe fully, perhaps for the very first time since becoming Prime Minister in May 1940, that Britain would not just survive this terrible war, but would actually truly win it. "When I see these young men," he had said, his voice thick with emotion, "I know we are going to win this war." It was not a boast designed to impress anyone. It was not propaganda meant for public consumption. It was a simple statement of fact, spoken by a man who had carried the absolutely crushing weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders alone for 2 impossibly long years, and who could finally, watching those American soldiers march steadily past, set that terrible weight down and share it with powerful allies who had the strength to help carry it forward to victory. The war would grind on relentlessly through more years of suffering. There would be setbacks and losses that would break hearts. There would be difficult decisions that would haunt the men who made them. There would be terrible casualties that would devastate families and communities. But the fundamental equation of the war had changed permanently on that day. Germany now faced not just Britain's stubborn defiance and determination, but America's overwhelming might and industrial power. And that single fact, Churchill knew with absolute certainty as he watched those young Americans march through London streets past bombed buildings toward an uncertain future, would make all the difference in the world.